I'm the statistician for the Roslin Institute, and I thought it would be useful to have this session because quite often people come to me with repeated measures data, well, what I would call repeated measures data, and it would help to sort of explain in a bit more detail why it needs special consideration. I'm going to just spend about an hour talking about sort of various ways you might consider analysing it, and probably concentrate most on using mixed models because these are a suitable way to analyse the data, particularly when you've got missing data, when you haven't got complete data at every time point. So feel free to interrupt with questions and discuss anything that isn't completely clear. First few slides are just really being sure what is repeated measures data, what constitutes what I would call repeated measures data. So it's when you've got measurements that are taken repeatedly on what I'd call the same units. So a unit might be an animal, it might be a patient. You might have different samples that you can measure from repeatedly. It's usually across time, but it could be across something else, such as you've got different dilutions of the same sample or some other way of repeating measurements that isn't time related. So this would be an example of repeated measures data. This was an experiment of different diets on crabs, where the crabs were measured repeatedly on 3 different diets, and these are the means and the standard errors at each time point. So it looks like they were measured every couple of days. But because there's multiple measurements taken on the same crab, they're not independent, and it's important to take that into account in an analysis. Another example would be looking at different treatments that are given to mice. So you've got the same mice observed at each time point here, and so you've got these 3 mice in the control group, 3 mice in the chlorum group. But the key thing is it's the same mice at each time point. So if you had, for example, different individuals at each time point, that's then not what I'd call repeated measures data, because you've got a different set of samples at each of the time points. Sometimes there are trials and experiments where you've got different interventions at the time points, and you've got the same individuals but they have different interventions at different time points, and although of course you are taking measurements repeatedly over time, it's not what I'd call repeated measures data because it's another type of design. In fact, something called the crossover design is an example of that. It's not strictly what we'd consider repeated measures data, because what you do is you change the treatment or the intervention over time on the same individuals. In this experiment, it was to see whether mice preferred tastes of different types of liquid, and the unit of experimentation was the cage rather than the mouse. So there were 4 different cages, and each cage was studied with a different fluid in turn. So you've got 5 periods, and each of the cages was given a different fluid in each period. So that's a different type of study that needs special consideration, but it's not repeated measurements. If it was repeated measures, then we'd have the same fluid studied across all the periods in each cage.